Good afternoon and welcome to the first congressional debate between Congressman Brian Fitzpatrick and Christina Finello, the Democratic challenger. I'm Rick Rickman with WBCB, joined by Tom Sofield of Levittown Now. Thank you for watching. Tom, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So today's going to be an exciting day. There's only 2 debates between these candidates. The next one is next week, and that's going to be a little north of here, I believe. And this, I think, is the one that everyone's looking to. This is the first time that Finello will be on the stage with Fitzpatrick. It'll be interesting to see how they match up. Any thoughts?
Yeah, so in a year without a lot of in-person events, this is definitely going to be one of the highlights because we're not having that for either side. You're not having a ton of, as you said, it's going to be the first time Christina Finello and Brian Fitzpatrick face off on stage in a highly watched congressional race. This year has been a lot different than most, but 10th year of the debate, there won't be a huge public audience, which will also make it unique, but it's still happening.
Yeah, and that's really important, I think, to point out is that even though there's all these social distancing guidelines, Bucks County Community College, we're at the Lower Epstein campus right now, they've taken every precaution to make sure that everything is safe here. So even when we're talking, we're wearing masks. When the candidates are down at the podiums, and we'll go there when the debate is about to start, that's on the floor below us, they have plexiglass between them and the moderator, Bill Pezza, of course, of Bristol Borough, is going to be moderating this again, as he does each midterm election. And so it is a different feel in here. There's seats 6 feet apart from select media groups allowed to be here. I believe there's only 2 or 3 who are going to be live streaming today's event, or one of them. And so it's kind of brought us together in a way, I think. Part of why we're working together this year is because it's different. We're taking advantage of it. As far as the effect that will have on the debate itself, I think it'll be pretty standard. Some of the questions will be geared toward the pandemic, I'm sure, as far as whether health crises or the economic policy that you might have. But in terms of the format, it's Bill Pezza. He does what he does. It's going to be questions for each candidate, and each one will have time to respond, and then we'll go to the next one. Whether he includes responses or not is up to him, but it seems like it's a pretty standard list of topics this year.
Yeah, and this debate will last just over, usually about an hour at clocks, and Bill tries to keep it pretty punctual compared to some debates that have gone on, but definitely a very different vibe here. A lot less people, a lot less background noise. Not that there's cheering or clapping usually allowed during the debate, but sometimes it does happen, so that will make this different for the candidates with just a small number of news outlets here. One thing that's notable too compared to past years is the kind of lack of outlets. There's local outlets, there's WBCB, Levittown Now, the Courier and Intelligencer, Delaware Valley News, but that seems to be the bulk of the outlets. Usually these first congressional district debates in previous years have drawn national coverage, the TV stations, the WHYY, and it doesn't seem like that's the case this year.
Yeah, it's great you point that out, because I think that can give us a little bit of insight. We were talking a little bit before the camera turned on, speculating as to the reason why. Is it because social distancing guidelines are so strict? But I think we both agree that it's probably just that it might just be a lower profile this year. A lot of focus is on the presidential election. Even the vice presidential debate is only I think it's tomorrow.
Yeah.
And then so that's drawing a lot of attention from these bigger news outlets like 6ABC or whoever it is, but we don't see them here today.
Yeah, and throughout the campaign, I also think the lack of in-person events has kind of hurt the profile of this race. And especially if you're a newcomer like Christina Finello, who doesn't have the name ID that Republican Brian Fitzpatrick does, that's going to make things difficult. They weren't out knocking doors either of the candidates early on as much. They're not having in-person fundraisers. They're not really bringing in the high-profile guests. The Fitzpatrick campaign really hasn't had any big events. Finello hasn't either. She brought in actor Richard Kahn from Mad About You in Spin City. Plenty of other things. He's a Pennsbury graduate over the weekend to hand out signs, but that wasn't it can't hurt. But it wasn't a high-profile event like it would have been in a regular.
huge media invite and all the supporters would be out. It was kind of,
maybe a few dozen people at the most.
Well, any incumbent is facing an uphill battle unless it's an outlier race where the person in office has just, messed up in a big way. But typically an incumbent has an advantage, and it's up to the newcomer, Finello in this case, to make their pitch to the people and say, this is how I'm different and this is what I'll offer. But as you said, door knocking is a lot. There's a lot of it this year. In-person events, sometimes just not possible. But also there's a matter of cash on hand, money, funding. I know the last numbers that I saw was a pretty big gap. Fitzpatrick, it might come from endorsements that he's received or, wherever it comes from. But I think the last time I saw it was 1.8 million in cash on hand back in June.
Right.
And Finello had 300,000. So there's a large gap there, and Finello would need that money to be able to put on ads on TV.
Oh, for sure.
To put up signs throughout the county because it's mostly Bucks County. There's parts of Montgomery, like Horsham, and those areas, but it is Bucks County. And Bucks is a big place.
Yep.
I think it's easy
and a
to
diverse
forget.
place.
It's a very diverse.
You have kind of central and lower Bucks, which are very suburban, and then you have the rural upper part of the county, and that seems to have a different political tendency and maybe not as modern.
in particular, being known nationally for being a very moderate place. You'll see Democrats who vote for Trump
and Republicans who vote for Biden because they're so moderate. It's not somewhere you can easily write off, and nationally it's known as a bellwether. And that's why it's so surprising to me to not see as much national attention on this race. And one thing you were talking about, the fundraising, just this morning the Fitzpatrick campaign announced in the third quarter they raised $900,000, which is a significant haul. They say it's the largest ever for the district. The Finello campaign tells me they're going to be releasing stats most likely tomorrow. I can't imagine their haul anywhere as close to that, but we'll see. But like you said, leading up to this, they have not been able to raise the money, and Fitzpatrick has the advantage of being the incumbent and being a moderate in a moderate district.
Yeah. I also think the other thing about this race is that as much as we know, I think there's a lot more that we just don't know. With the implementation of mail-in ballots, more people are requesting them than ever before. Also, there's the, you can look at the polls that have been released, and some of them tell a different story. Some of them are here and there. I think a general trend, though, which was interesting to me, especially from a Democratic polling firm, was that there seems to be a gap in of about double digits between Finello and Fitzpatrick, and one of the main factors is, and as we pointed before, just a lack of name recognition. Fitzpatrick has that going back a decade in this county, between his brother Mike, who passed away earlier this year, and then of course he's been making a name for himself, whether you like it or not. Georgetown ranked him as the most independent congressman in Congress. Now, whether you, or at least in the House, whether you put stock in that or not is up to the voter.
Right.
But it will be interesting to see how the pandemic makes an impact on this race, because I think we're going to be very surprised about a number of different races come November. But whether it's this one, I'm not so sure. I think this is, it's an uphill battle for Finello.
Right. And one thing Finello hasn't necessarily seen, obviously her campaign would say they've seen outside support, but they haven't seen as much outside support as Scott Wallace did, or Kathy Brockvar, or Kevin Strauss or Steve Sanacero, where it seemed like there was a lot more national attention from the Democrats on this race.
Yeah.
Doesn't seem like we're seeing that this time around, where Fitzpatrick's still getting support from the national Republicans. He's had Kevin McCarthy, Steve Scalise do fundraisers for him. So there hasn't been that this year on the Democratic side, and I don't know if they wrote it off. Finello wasn't the candidate it seemed like the Democrats initially wanted. They talked to several. Deb Washpress was a big, she was able to bring in large hauls of money.
It seemed like she might have been the nominee had there not been a controversy earlier this year.
Yeah, her campaign was derailed and ended, and she had a lot of cash on hand, and Finello was kind of the last man standing because you had Judy Reese who had left the race before that.
Mm-hmm. And then, of course, there was, it ended up being a debate earlier this year, and that was the first time we saw Finello on the big stage. It was between her and Skylar Hurwitz.
Right.
And it was, a pretty clear divide between them, even though they're both Democrats. Skylar Horwitz said that he was inspired by Bernie Sanders, and that he wanted to do Medicare for all, and it was those kind of policies that he was talking about back in the debate, whereas Finello was more hesitant to say. She actually didn't say who she would support most in the primary, which was an interesting decision, but I don't think it hurt her. But it was just, they clearly divided themselves, and now we'll see if that helps her or not come November. But as you were saying, she was kind of the last person standing. So
yeah, and I mean, Skylar ran a great grassroots campaign that had tons of support with very little money. And that's where Christina, she had more money than Skylar, but his campaign seemed to be effective with getting on the grassroots, getting people out. Christina, her campaign was seeking donations. They did see an uptick after she became the nominee, but they haven't been able to stage the type of ground game or advertising game that the Fitzpatrick campaign has. And in this district that's large and with the pandemic, that advertising money is going to come to good use for the campaign that can pull the most in.
Yeah. These are, this seems to be the mood throughout the county. It seems like everyone's kind of on the same page when it comes to the things that we've been talking about so far. One insight that Bill Pezza, actually our moderator today, had during a panel with PCN, who's also here. He was on a panel with two other professors in the local area, and they were talking essentially about what we're talking about right now, the upcoming election. And he pointed out voter registration. And so I was looking at the numbers earlier today, and they just released the most up-to-date voter registration numbers for October 5th. And it seems like back in 2016, the Democrats had about a 10,000 voter registration lead. And then the interesting thing is that independent voters haven't really been registering. It was 74,000 back in 2016. Now it's 75,000.
Right.
So it seems like it's going to be people seem to know what they want come November. But that 10,000 difference has grown to 12,000 for Democrats. So whether Finello gets her name out there or not, I think there's going to be that downstream effect on the ticket where, people, I expect Bucks will go, if only by a little bit like it did back in 2016, I expect it to go for Biden. And I would be surprised if that didn't help her come November. I don't know.
Right. Well, I think that's one of the kind of risks for Fitzpatrick. He's had a very difficult line to toe, and it's only become harder. Whether he supports President Trump, he said he didn't vote for him.
Yeah. In
2016, he wrote in Mike Pence, who's obviously the vice president and was Trump's running mate. So he's obviously not a huge fan. You can tell by statements he said. He's disagreed with the president, which I think in a normal political climate would be fine.
Yeah.
In the age we live in, a lot of the time disagreeing with the president among his supporters is kind of seen as this terrible thing if anyone has any dissent, and it might hurt him. There's a lot of Republicans, Andy Meehan, kind of the firebrand candidate who ran against Brian in the primary and lost, but he managed to drum up supporters who really don't like Brian, and some of them have said they're not going to vote. Now, on the other hand, will Brian be able to get enough other Republicans out? Will he be able to get enough Democratic voters out? I mean, he's, as you've said, a moderate is how he paints his campaign, and Christina Finello does too, that she's also a moderate. So that's what's going to be interesting. And how much will the Trump effect play into this?
Yeah. It's hard to say that it wouldn't have a major impact on this race. I think, like you said, the way that Fitzpatrick has been trying to manage his way and tiptoe through the minefield has been almost fascinating to watch as it is a football game,
Yeah.
Voting for the tax bill and then voting against repealing the ACA and then, voting for the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act earlier this year, but also voting against the impeachment of the president. So these are going to be major things, but it seems like at least in the major news cycle, it's just pandemic. Right. And so I question, will voters remember all of this come November, or will it be, I don't like how things are right now, and I want to change?
Yeah, And I mean, I think that could be a positive or a negative, especially with Donald Trump in office. Things change. He sends one tweet, and that changes the whole message of the campaign. I remember covering Brian Fitzpatrick 2016 campaign, and one of his aides at the time had told me it makes it difficult to get a message out there, especially leading up to Election Day, because Donald Trump would send one tweet or have one controversy that he would kind of fan the flames of. And all of a sudden, the campaign locally would have to be responding to reporters' questions, especially regionally and nationally, about their reaction to that. And it makes it tough if you're trying to be on the offense, having to run a reactionary campaign to your own party.
Yeah, it's definitely it's got to be tricky for them, like you're saying.
Yeah.
At the same time, I think there's a lot of who knows with this upcoming election. I will say that, we've talked about name recognition, we've talked about cash on hand. There's also the endorsement factor.
Right.
And I think there are several issues where Finello has to say that she's the more moderate, but on a slightly different level.
Right.
Because if you go into the booth and you're a high information voter and you want to choose between the person who paints himself as a moderate or the other person who paints himself as a moderate, and I think it'll come down to a couple of issues. If it was in a different district, I think it would be really easy for Finello to say, on the environment or on police reform or on, whether it's healthcare, which is also one of the more important topics this year. But Fitzpatrick, as we talked about, has been very careful in where he places his feet in the minefield that is present day politics. So he does have the endorsement of several local environmental groups. He has the Brady Gun Control Group endorsement. I'm not trying to gas up Fitzpatrick here, but it's going to be tricky for Finello to differentiate herself in a way that normal Democratic voters would have an easy time of looking at and saying, oh, these are the issues that Finello is different on, and so that's why I'm voting for her. I think it's a little trickier. And obviously they do differ on some things. Fitzpatrick, he endorsed the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, but he also sponsored legislation to punish cities that defund the police. So it's definitely going to be tricky for him.
Yeah, especially for most voters. And I mean, a lot of Brian Fitzpatrick's stances on issues have been formed out of nuance. He's a former FBI special agent and, a trained attorney. So they look at things with a lot more nuance than some voters do. And that can make things different and very interesting for this campaign.
Yeah, and also there's the issue of and we talked about this briefly, but there, of course, I think this week is when the county is sending out these mail-in ballots.
Right.
We expected them to go out a little bit earlier in mid-September, but I think there was, lawsuit troubles.
Yeah, there was a challenge, and then the county last week was expecting them to go out, and it looks like tomorrow might be the day that the first batches go out.
So people are finally going to be getting their ballots, maybe later on this week, maybe early next week. There's so many of them that they have to send out, hundreds of thousands, it seems like. And I think based on the results that we saw in the primary, right, where it was actually a fairly close race between Fitzpatrick and Meehan in the primary, but there was still about a 10-point difference between them.
Probably much closer than the Fitzpatrick campaign would like.
Right, and then that was after in-person voting, and then it was fairly close. And then once the mail-in ballots came in, the divide started to grow, and it became clear that voters, had chosen Fitzpatrick by not the widest of margins, but by a decent amount. And then on the other side, with Finello and Hurwitz, it was clear that Democratic voters had chosen the mail-in ballot option overwhelmingly.
Yeah.
And
I think that might cause some confusion. I mean, I'm working on a story right now. I've talked to several just calls from readers who have asked. One guy right here in West Bristol, not far from the campus, he had called and told me that he was very confused because he got a Trump campaign branded mail-in voting application. And he was convinced that this was something that may have been a trick or not real. He also said he was concerned about going to vote in person. I did talk to the Trump campaign, and they said they are sending out or supporting mail-in voting applications and ballots in Pennsylvania, but that messaging from the president can be confusing, and I have to wonder if there's more people like the gentleman who called me, or more people like the just generally confused people who have called and have legitimate questions about it, and I'm wondering why Republicans are sending mail-in ballot applications. Is that going to hurt them, especially in a district like this?
Yeah,
where every vote counts?
Yeah, and it'll be interesting. I mean, I know this is also on a national level, but talk about election night. In years past, reporters go to Doylestown or to the different headquarters where
right.
the parties are, and you see what's going on, how do they feel about it, the results come in, and then by midnight, 1 a.m., typically you have an idea of who is going to be sitting in this case, the county commissioner's seat, the row offices, right. Even in 2016, who was going to be president. And it's been talked about extensively on a national scale, and whether the county is prepared to handle these mail-in ballots. They say they are. At the same time, even back in early spring, I was talking to some of the people who are handling the election on the county level, and they said, we're probably not going to know the results for a couple of days, and that was for the primary. Right. And you saw it in the primary.
Right.
It took a week to find out if there was something else coming in. So I can't imagine that we know who the president is going to be, even in the first week.
Well, right? And that may be a place that campaigns and maybe even foreign adversaries could sow some division by saying, look, we don't know who it is. This candidate was winning in the early portions of this race or post-election, and now they're losing once the mail-in ballots are counted. It's going to be a huge cause for confusion. I know the Bucks County commissioners, especially Commissioner DiGirolamo, has really pushed the state legislature, which he used to be a member of, to allow pre-canvassing, allow for the opening of ballots in the days leading up to Election Day instead of starting at 7 a.m. that morning, so they can get through as many as possible, because that was a major holdup in the primary.
Yeah, I think he sent that letter just within the last week. And he was trying to urge these legislators to change how they count these ballots. And I just, on a personal level, I wish that this had been taken care of back even before the primary, Right. Like, I think that there is a way to go about changing the election system. And to me, it doesn't seem like it's a good idea to change it 1 month before one of the most divided presidential elections in decades.
Right. Well, you have the Supreme Court decision, the state Supreme Court decision threw things off, and I mean, Commissioner DiGirolamo said, who would have expected when they bipartisan support for the bill last year, who would have thought there'd be a global pandemic? I know also Republicans and Democrats have kind of criticized the fact that everything's changing previous to the pandemic, that they were introducing this new system in a presidential election year, and especially one that's expected to have such high turnout. But they can't change it now, and mail-in voting is going to be underway starting tomorrow. The counties open their drop boxes for ballots, so it's definitely speeding right at us. Yeah,
and I'm wondering how they'll approach it. At least even from a news standpoint, how could we possibly tackle this upcoming election in a way that's not confusing for people? I think we're going to be confused at times.
Right.
It could be 3 days after the election has already taken place, and we're still counting in these ballots. And I know the Supreme Court recently decided, I think as you alluded to keep counting ballots that arrive by the Friday after the election. So there's no way, really, that we could even expect to know by the end of the week.
Right.
Now I think we just got a call. There's about 2 minutes left before we go to the podiums. I think Fitzpatrick and Finello will be arriving soon.
We're 90 seconds out now. The two candidates will be entering their first time debating, and I don't know if they've seen each other in person at all.
Right.
It's hard to know. This. There hasn't been the kind of traditional forms. Now 60 seconds out. They're going to be getting up there. Bill Pezza, who's been doing this, I believe, about 10 years, since Patrick Murphy was running against Mike Fitzpatrick. Yeah. And he's going to be getting up there, and it's going to be an interesting debate. And, both these candidates paint themselves as relative moderates. And I think by Brian Fitzpatrick has his positive and negative, is the incumbent. So he has his past that can haunt him or help him. Christina Finello, a political newcomer, both are attorneys, so they're very articulate, both of them. So it's going to make an interesting debate.
Yeah, and they've each got their local ties. I believe Finello was born in Bristol, I think, as she said. And now she's out in Ivyland as a council member.
Yeah, her dad's a district judge in Warminster.
Yeah, and so one thing that I don't know if we touched on so far is that she has a different angle than Wallace did back in 2018, where he was painted as an outsider. And some local educators have made the same point, where Finello doesn't have to worry about being called an outsider.
Right.
So I think that was a big talking point for the Fitzpatrick campaign back in the day. Now they don't have to worry about it.
Yeah, and here comes the candidates, Brian Fitzpatrick and Christina Finello, with moderator Bill Pezza.
They're walking up right now. It looks like Fitzpatrick is going to be on the left side. Bill Pezza, of course, in the middle, as always, and then Finello will be on the right.
All wearing masks.
They are all wearing masks, taking it off when they speak.
On behalf of President Stephanie Shamblatt, we welcome you to this congressional debate for the 1st Congressional District of Pennsylvania, coming to you from the Epstein campus of Bucks County Community College. The college has sponsored a debate in each congressional election since 2010. We are proud to be a participant in this ongoing celebration of democracy. Our candidates are incumbent Republican Congressman Brian Fitzpatrick, to my right, and his Democratic challenger, Christina Finello. My name is Bill Pezza. I'm from the Social and Behavioral Science Department here at the college. The candidates are live with me on campus. However, because of COVID restrictions, aside from media representatives, our room is virtually empty. Voters like yourselves are viewing the debate via media broadcasts. In the room are the following strict COVID protocols. There are 12 people in a room that normally houses 200. All received a health check at the door. Everyone is at least 10 feet separation, and candidates are separated by plexiglass, which allows them to remove their masks. This debate will last 75 minutes. Each candidate is allocated 2 minutes for an opening address. They will be followed by questions and then a 1-minute rebuttal. A 1-minute closing statement. The order of speaking will alternate. Each candidate will have 2 minutes to respond to the same question and will be allocated 1 minute for a rebuttal. I reserve the right to ask a follow-up question if warranted. Our timekeeper is Jessica Volsens, and she will notify the candidates by holding a yellow placard when you have 30 seconds left on your time, and a red placard when your time is up. When your time is up, when you see the red placard, you're asked to finish your sentence and close your comments. Members of the public were invited to submit questions or topics for the debate, and the questions asked today represent a synthesis of those submissions. The vast majority of submissions dealt with domestic rather than foreign policy issues, and the questions today will reflect that preference. The order of speaking was determined by coin toss. We'll begin with an opening statement by Christina Finello. Ms. Finello, you have 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, and thank you so much to Mr. Pezza, to the Lower Bucks campus of Bucks County Community College for having us here to debate the issues. I also would like to give a special shout out to my parents. It's their anniversary today, so happy anniversary, Mom and Dad, because if that event didn't happen, I wouldn't be with you today. So let me tell you a little bit about myself. I'm Christina Finello, and we need a representative in Washington who understands what her constituents are going through and has been there herself. We don't have a representative right now looking out for us. Growing up and working in my community will give me a unique perspective that I will take with me when I am your Congresswoman. I've been working in this community to provide services and resources to those people that I serve. And I understand the challenges that we face. I know what it's like to worry about losing health care insurance because of a pre-existing condition. When I was pregnant with my first daughter, my husband had to switch jobs, and my insurance company told me that my health care might not be covered because of a pre-existing condition, my pregnancy. And I also understand the economic challenges of this district. And I've known about these challenges since I was a child. And these were problems long before the pandemic. But we need somebody who's in the position and somebody who understands the urgency that's involved with dealing with these problems. And I also know, though, what a difference one good job can make. Growing up, my parents struggled for what they had, but then when my dad got his union job, everything changed. Got a lot of opportunities, and I want to give those same opportunities to people in my district. And right now, we have a congressman who votes against us. If he has a chance to choose between our district and voting with his party and Trump, when it matters most, he always chooses his party and Trump. And he's not the independent that he claims to be, whose record says otherwise, whose votes go to the highest bidder in corporate interests, and who votes for the Trump tax bill that gave wealthy and big business the lion's share of benefits and gutted the ACA, taking away health care for people, millions of people with health care conditions. I'm running for Congress to have a real representative in Washington. Thank you.
Thank you. Congressman Fitzpatrick?
Thank you, Mr. Pezza, for hosting, as you always have, and do a phenomenal job. Christina, thank you for participating today. To our audience, things look very, very different this year, don't they? And I'm assuming the hot dog tradition is no longer
No hot
current,
dogs today.
unfortunately. But you know, I thank the people that are here and everybody who's watching through live stream for participating in your democracy and in your government. I do miss seeing the kids up in the upper level. I always like to speak directly to them, but I know you're watching as well because this is all about you. My name's Brian Fitzpatrick. I am completing my second term as your U.S. Representative, formerly of the 8th District, currently of the 1st District. I was born and raised in Levittown. My parents still live in the home where they raised 8 amazing kids, and I live in Middletown Township, in the township that I grew up in. Many of you knew how I got here. I spent 14 years as an FBI special agent. It's a job that I loved. It's a job that I miss. I miss the people that I worked with, some of the most amazing people I've ever known. But I made that tough decision for one reason and one reason only. Like you all, I love my country, and I wanted to step forth and be a bridge builder at a time when I felt that bridge building is desperately needed right now. And what does bridge building mean? What does it involve? First of all, it involves viewing diversity of thought as a strength and not a weakness. It involves listening more than lecturing. It involves not allowing the perfect to be the enemy of the good. It involves understanding that 80% of something is better than 100% of nothing. That is why I'm the vice chair in leadership of the Bipartisan Problem Solvers Caucus, a group of 25 Democrats and 25 Republicans who build personal relationships with each other, who respect each other. We are friends with one another. We sit together at the State of the Union address. We go to each other's districts, what we call district swaps. And every bill we advance is bipartisan in nature. That's what our country needs so desperately right now more than ever. And that's why I'm running for re-election. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman. Our first question is on the topic of the pandemic. The most compelling issue facing America today is COVID-19, its impact on the general health of the population as well as on the economy. Please evaluate the White House and Congressional how the White House and Congress have addressed the pandemic from a public health perspective. We'll address the economic impact in a subsequent question. And we start with Congressman Fitzpatrick for 2 minutes.
Yeah, thank you, Bill. I think it's pretty clear that we could have done a lot better on all levels, federal, state, and local, across the board. It was called a novel coronavirus for a reason. It's novel, it's new. There was a lot of learning that has occurred, and what I've advocated for is that we take a very similar approach to COVID-19 and this pathogen and pandemic as we did to 9/11. In 9/11, right afterwards, we came together as a country, we got through it, and then after we were through that awful situation that our country endured, we formed the 9/11 Commission. They came up with over 40 recommendations that were followed up on by Congress. We deployed and the changes in the aviation system, TSA screeners, armed pilots in airports and airlines, fortified cockpits, deploying a federal air marshal program, the likes of which our country's never seen, deploying sophisticated AT screening devices across all 450 airports in our country. We said never again. We need to take that same never again attitude towards COVID-19 as we did 9/11. I've introduced 3 pieces of legislation that all advance and cooperate and coincide with one another. All 3 are bipartisan, one with Anthony Brindisi, my Democrat colleague from New York, one with Gil Cisneros, my Democrat colleague from California, and one with Connor Lamb, my Democrat colleague from Pennsylvania, to deal with the insurance issue, the supply chain issue and the international tripwire issue to prevent something like this from ever happening again. And if we implement those three pieces of legislation, we can say never again to COVID-19, like we did in 9/11. But I think that once we get through this, which we will, that's when the commission needs to be established, and we look at the response at all levels of government, federal, state, and local, just like we did with 9/11, what worked and what didn't work.
Thank you, Congressman. But before we move on, I'm told that we need to increase the volume of the Congressman's microphone, if anyone can do that. And Mrs. Finello.
So our first priority needs to be to protect the health and safety of our community. We need to listen to experts. Our decisions have got to be based in science, not driven by political games. You know, we know tons of people, I've talked to many people in this community who have a loved one that's sick with COVID. Hundreds of thousands of people have died from, coronavirus. Hundreds of thousands of people have been sick with COVID. You know, and when we've lost those thousands to COVID, our president called them nobodies. They're not nobodies. They're people not only that live in this district, but others that, and their families are stricken by grief because of it. You know, and there's countless people who are recovering from COVID, and they're the lucky ones. But now they're going to have a pre-existing condition. You know, what bothers me the most is Trump and Republicans in Congress, like my opponent, desperately tried to shift the blame for their party's failures to take this virus seriously, and the failure to listen to medical experts, and the failure to keep America safe. You know, my opponent's been in lockstep with Donald Trump every step of the way. You know, Donald Trump played down the severity of this virus, and so has my Republican opponent. You know, he said our trajectory is more like South Korea's than Italy's, and he stood by while the severity was downplayed. And in the meantime, we should have been ramping up testing, we should have been ramping up contact tracing, and we should have been ramping up the production of personal protective equipment so that our frontline workers had what they needed. These are the things that we needed to do. Again, we have to be guided by experts, and we have to be guided by experts' opinions to get through this. The health and safety of our community is paramount, and we have to make sure that we are doing that. We have to make sure that we adhere to wearing masks. You know, there's been countless instances of my opponent and his people going around without masks, and we can't have that. The safety and health of the community must take precedence.
Thank you. 1 minute rebuttal, Mr. Congressman Fitzpatrick.
Sure. If Christina wants to compare what her and I respectively did in response to COVID-19, I'm happy to have that debate. Christina, the death rate of the United States was closer to South Korea than it was Italy. That's a fact. So I don't know what you're referring to there, but I can tell you that our response, we've been working around the clock all day, every day, on all sides of this, including our district office, who's done a phenomenal job helping people out of all walks of life. And Christina, those constituents are very, very appreciative of the work we've done. I'm sorry that you're not. And when it comes to health, of course, that's the top priority. I've said that from day one. I see JD and Phil here. We had a podcast right in the midst of this, and I repeated that repeatedly over and over again. Clearly, we have to do that. But my perspective is that let's come together as a country to get through this. We can analyze after the fact, like we did after 9/11, what worked and what didn't work and what we need to fix. But it makes no sense to tear each other down right in the midst of a pandemic when we got to get through this together.
Mrs. Finello, 1 minute response.
You know, what I'm referring to was that my Republican opponent went on to a radio show and talked about how our trajectory was, and the Philadelphia Inquirer actually said that that was a false statement. But more so than that, you know, we have to stop playing political games and saying that we're blaming each other. People are dying from this. People are continuing to suffer in this district, and people are not getting the relief that they need, while everybody stands around and says, oh, we're doing this and we're doing that. The relief needs to be passed, and it needs to be passed now. People needed help back in the spring. You know, my opponents saw fit to vote against extending relief when hardworking families needed it the most. I'm talking to people too, Congressman Fitzpatrick, and while they might be appreciative of some of the things that have been done, they're not appreciative of the fact that we're still here and it did not have to be this bad. But the continual downplaying of the virus has caused us to be where we are.
Could I respond to that, Bill?
Thank you. You know what? The next question sticks with the COVID topic, so let's go there, okay? This is a continuation of that. There is a considerable anxiety over the mixed messages coming from health professionals and the White House regarding the development, testing, and distribution of a vaccine. What can Congress do to ensure that ultimate decisions about the efficacy and safety of the vaccine will be made by scientific community and that the distribution will be efficient? And let's start with Mrs. Finello, 2 minutes.
So, again, we have to make sure that we are continuing to look at what is happening with this virus. Again, this has been tough on all of us, and it did not have to be this bad. I can't tell you the amount of people that I talk to that are so concerned about whether we're ever going to get through this, because right now they're facing things like loss of job. They don't know how they're going to get by. Their additional unemployment has run out, and they're just not sure how they're going to get by. So, of course, we need a vaccine as quickly as possible, but again, the decisions about whether that vaccine is ready, how it will be distributed, is incumbent upon us listening to the experts, not playing political games, not standing out there and talking about, how this virus is, like Donald Trump said, like this virus is the flu. This is not, downplaying this has gotten us nowhere. We need to quickly make sure that we are doing everything we can, listening to scientists, and making sure that we have a vaccine that is ready to go, but not something that we're dangling in front of the voters before November 3rd, thinking something's ready when it's not, because we're playing political games with their lives. We're talking about listening to the experts. That is what is critical here, and that is what this administration and my Republican opponent have not done. We must listen to the experts.
Thank you. Congressman, 2 minutes.
Yeah, I'm listening to the experts every day, and I think we ought to continue to do that with this. It's referred to as Operation Warp Speed because of the time sensitivity of this, but of course, that needs to take us a second seat to health and safety. Of course we need to do that, but we also need to factor in, there's legislation out there which I authored and got across the finish line through a lot of special interest objections, by the way, called Right to Try. That's coming into play here. So, of course we need to follow the science, give people that choice. If a vaccine is developed, and there are many companies that are reportedly doing well on it, but again, it's got to follow the normal FDA protocol. Obviously, they're assigning many more people and resources and scientists towards this project than they would for some other therapy that was coming through the FDA pipeline. So if it's moving faster because there's more hands on deck, which there should be, great, but it's got to be, for sure, safe and give people that choice.
Thank you. 1 minute rebuttal.
When we do get the vaccine, I'm just more than a little concerned about whether folks will be able to have access to it. You know, one of the votes that my opponent took was for the Trump tax bill that, 7 days after this election, there is a Supreme Court case where the ACA could be struck down and millions of people with pre-existing conditions, hundreds of thousands in this district, could lose their health care. So what then around how is somebody that can barely put food on their table and barely pay for the medications that they have, how are they going to be able to afford this medication? That is gravely concerning to me, because we have to make sure in order for people to be able to get this vaccine, it has to be accessible for them. It's something that they have to be able to have it. And that is my concern right now. Again, if we listen to the experts and make sure that it's the vaccine and it's a good vaccine that actually works, we also then have to make sure that people can actually be able to have it accessible to them.
Congressman, 1 minute.
Christina, I voted against every single attempt to repeal the ACA. And moreover, on top of that, voted for the Democrat rules package to make sure the pre-existing conditions were protected. And on top of that, voted for another Democrat rule to make sure that any litigation that I supported the ACA, I sided with the Democrats on that. So you're either unaware of that or you're being intentionally disingenuous. I understand it's an issue that polls well, but let's tell the truth here. I have been a staunch supporter of protecting pre-existing conditions, a staunch supporter of the ACA at every single juncture, every time it's come up.
Thank you. And we're going to be visiting the ACA in more detail shortly.
Excellent.
Our next question is race relations. This is the most explosive era of race relations in decades, brought to a head by police shootings and protests that followed. Our traditions are strongly Our traditions strongly embrace support for our police, law and order, and racial justice. Unfortunately, many see the current turmoil as a binary choice. One can either support the Black Lives Matter movement or support the police. How do we bridge that perceived divide? We start with Congressman Fitzpatrick, 2 minutes.
Thanks, Bill. It's an issue, obviously, that I've taken personally, being the only FBI agent in Congress, a career law enforcement official, and also someone who voted for the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. I support law enforcement. I always have and I always will. But do we need reforms? Of course we do. And they will acknowledge that. I've pulled the police chiefs together across our district multiple times. I've been in constant communication with them. And to their credit, they're stepping up and they're being leaders here. And if Bucks County Bucks County is really what should be the example in the microcosm across America. We have phenomenal police officers and police chiefs in Bucks County. They have stepped forth. They provided me recommendations. I was then able to work with Karen Bass, my colleague from California, Democrat colleague, chairwoman of the Congressional Black Caucus, who was the author of the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. Her and I are working together, along with our Problem Solvers Caucus, to come up with a package that works for law enforcement and also deals with the inequities that have existed in the system for a long, long time. We can and must accomplish both, but we have to do it still respecting the women and men who wear the uniform every day, which I always have and I always will, because they have a very, very tough job, and their job is tougher now than it ever has been. And that's why I've been so strongly opposing this very, very reckless and irresponsible defund the police movement. We need to be protecting and funding our police departments if we want them to enact the reforms, increase the training, increase the use of body cameras, have enhanced community policing. That requires money and funding, and we need to give them that funding.
Thank you. Mrs. Finello, 2 minutes.
So let me be clear here, because, you know, my opponent and his campaign have taken to lie about this. I oppose defunding the police. You know, and I've been endorsed by the sheriffs of both Bucks and Montgomery County because they know my commitment to law enforcement and to all people in this community when I was working in Bucks County as the Deputy of Housing and Human Services. But our police system should be able to keep everyone safe and treat everyone equally. This is, you know, this is something that we have to make sure our system is doing. And we have to improve the relationship between our law enforcement and the communities that they're sworn to protect. You know, I'm eager to be part of the debate about how we ensure that other agencies like mental health and social services also get funding so that they don't have to be pushed on as extra duties on police officers. Oftentimes, you know, I've worked a lot with police officers both in Philadelphia in de-escalation training and also in Bucks County. And oftentimes they encounter situations which they have little or no training for, but they're very complex situations. So we have to make sure that these systems are working together. You know, I also support the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. Like I said, I'm someone who's worked in the mental health field. I've led de-escalation trainings with police. I know how very important it is that we get the resources to all parts of the system as part of a good community policing effort. You know, we have to be more thoughtful about the role we expect our police to play in our communities. You know, I would encourage funding for community policing, body cameras, and of course funding for de-escalation trainings. That's just been another tool on the tool belt of our police officers. You know, also would ban chokeholds, no-knock warrants, all of those things that we need to do to improve those relationships. And it's incredibly important we do that for our communities, for our law enforcement, and for the people that we serve.
Thank you. Congressman, 1 minute.
Yeah, so Christina just referenced an endorsement. Every single police organization out there has endorsed our campaign. The Bucks County FOP, the Montgomery County FOP, the State Police Lodge. Christina conveniently announces an endorsement this morning of 2 Democrat politicians. That's the best she could do. When it comes to defunding the police, look at her actions. Don't listen to her words. She was openly critical of a bill that I have that would prevent any defunding of the police that was bipartisan on introduction. Multiple Democrat co-sponsors that got behind this piece of legislation. She criticized it. So Christina, you can say all you want that you're opposed to defunding the police, but if you were, you would be at the very least not critical, but hopefully supportive of it. And I haven't seen you once stand up for our police officers in Bucks County. Not once. I haven't seen you condemn the riots forcefully at all. I've been to multiple rallies supporting our minority communities in the rally that we had in Bristol and Lower Mayfield, but I've also backed our police officers. I have not yet seen you do that.
Thank you. I'm happy to say that we're actually 2 minutes ahead of schedule.
Do
So
I
I
get
want
to
to stay.
I'm sorry, do I get to respond?
I'm sorry. Yes, you do.
Thank you.
1 minute.
Thank you, I
Now we're
appreciate
only 1
that.
minute ahead of schedule.
Yes, thank you. So a couple of things, yes. I mean, I can talk about all the events and things that I've been to with him. I've actually been at one in Bristol with Congressman Fitzpatrick, but no matter. Let me talk a little bit about this bill this for-show bipartisan bill he wants me to, that I haven't said I support it, because I don't. Because one of the things is the answer to dealing with police reform is not taking away money. And the Congressman bill wants to take away money that can be used for dealing with, that can be used for police functions in the municipalities. It's community development block grant money. So to me, the answer isn't taking away more money. You said it yourself. It's we need resources to combat the problem. So taking away money is not the answer.
Could I respond to that, Bill?
Okay. Well, I'm going to stay with the topic, and
Sure,
let's
okay.
do it that way, okay? We are still 2 minutes ahead of time, so I want to stay with this topic. There's been a lot of inflammatory rhetoric about the whole protest thing and about the police. I did some research. Well, first of all, to my knowledge, the FBI and the Southern Poverty Law Center and the JDL say there is no such thing as an Antifa, that there's a concept, but not a structured organization. The FBI has said that white supremacy poses the greatest domestic threat to the country. The JDL, and as I said, in the Southern Poverty Law Center, commented on those things. Is there such a thing as Antifa? How should we deal with this rhetoric? How should we deal with extremist groups on both sides of the spectrum? And again, I'm going to stay with Mr. Congressman Fitzpatrick. We'll do 1 minute each. Congressman?
Yeah, so this goes into the bifurcation and FBI classification of domestic versus international terrorists. So international terrorists, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, Ansar al-Sharia, Hamas, Hezbollah, foreign-based organizations that seek to undermine our democracy. Domestic terrorist groups are homegrown entities that are funded covertly and in a clandestine manner. Of course, I mean, Antifa, you can call them tightly or loosely affiliated or however you want to classify them. They are an organization. They do have covert funding, because you ask any police officer that's trying to quell these riots around the country, these people are showing up through public transportation, sometimes via airplane. They're being lodged in hotels. The money is coming from somewhere, and that ought to be looked at.
Good. Mrs. Finello?
The single biggest domestic threat we know to our nation has been said by the DOJ is white supremacist groups. And we haven't heard anything from our president. In fact, our president actually did a little shout out in his debate to them, and we heard nothing from my Republican opponent denouncing that. We have to take threats seriously, and when somebody tells us that there is a serious threat to be taken, we actually have to do that. And I think that's incredibly important. So, all the domestic threats, but we have the ones that are the real domestic threats, the ones that are identified to us, are the ones that we have to deal with.
Thank you. We're going to move on to the Affordable Care Act. President Trump has repeatedly advocated repeal of the Affordable Care Act and supported attempts to overturn it in the courts. What would you do in Congress to ensure that Americans have access to quality, affordable health care and that pre-existing conditions will continue to be covered? Finally, there is increasing concern that insurance companies may regard COVID as a pre-existing condition and deny coverage if the ACA is repealed. We'll start with Mrs. Finello.
Yes, so let me harken back to something that my opponent said, because I want it to be really crystal clear here to the voters about what we're talking about here with pre-existing conditions. This is something that's very important to me. You heard about my pregnancy being treated as one, and my daughter has a pre-existing condition. So let me just explain what I know. So what I know is that I have an opponent who voted for the Trump tax bill that gutted the ACA, the very same bill that the Trump administration is using in the Supreme Court right now, that case that will be heard 7 days after the election, and says that any congressperson that voted for that bill voted with the intent to gut the ACA. So that means pre-existing conditions. You can lose your health care because of a pre-existing condition. And everything else that happens after, and all these other bills that might have been introduced, that's all merely window dressing, because when you take the vote to rip health care away from people, that's a very serious thing. A thing that many people in this district are very concerned about. Over 300,000 people in this district have a pre-existing condition. They want to make sure that their health care is going to be there when they need it the most, when they need it for their pre-existing condition. So I do know what I'm talking about when I speak about this. So I just want to make sure that the voters are clear about what is happening here. You know, and we have to make, and on the topic of health care, women's health care is also under attack. You know, we need to have a representative that supports women's health care, and we have a representative that holds very extreme views on that. You know, when I was pregnant with my daughter, there was a chance that she was going to be born with some medical conditions where she wasn't going to be born alive. And we had to make some tough decisions, and I could not imagine anyone else being involved in that decision. I couldn't imagine the government interfering with that decision. It all went okay for me. My daughter was born healthy, albeit with a birth defect and a pre-existing condition. But my opponent wants to put that decision in the hands of politicians, not women.
Congressman, 2 minutes.
Christina, I'm going to try to give you the benefit of the doubt and assume that you just don't know what you're talking about rather than saying that you're intentionally lying to people. Every single attempt to repeal the ACA, even from the budget vehicle that they launched in the 115th Congress, I voted against. And every bill to support the ACA in the 116th Congress, I voted for. Her whole mantra is about one vote, the tax bill, which what it addressed was, on the health care front, the individual mandate. So, Christina, if we're talking about the individual mandate, let's have that debate. Let's have that debate, because the individual mandate, which I believe in a mandate, I just didn't believe in that mandate because that mandate was broken. 10 years after the passage of the ACA, where this individual mandate was designed to make sure everybody had health insurance, over 30 million people, 10 years after the passage of the ACA, did not have health insurance because the way the individual mandate in the ACA was constructed was broken. So we should fix that. But you can't say that individual mandate worked when 30 million people did not have health insurance. They were making a cost-effective decision that it was more cost-effective, particularly our younger generation, that it was more cost-effective to pay the fine than it was to get insurance. That's what needs to be fixed. But Christina, please, and I know you know this. I know you know this because every single organization that cares about this issue has endorsed me over you. The school teachers, the unions, our healthcare workers, our nurses, they've all endorsed us, and they care immensely about this, and they know I do too.
All right, you can each use your rebuttal time as you see fit, but let me try to focus it a little bit. You're saying that the congressman has voted against the ADA on numerous occasions. You're saying you never have, except for the individual mandate. Let's deal with that. You're first.
No, let me be clear. I didn't say that I said anything that happens after that is irrelevant, because if you're going to take a vote, yes, for something, yeah, there are certainly parts of the ACA that need to be improved. But again, the answer is let's vote to take everything away. And you're going to take away, with your vote, you could, if it is successful in the Supreme Court, you will have voted to take away health care with people with pre-existing conditions, hundreds of thousands of people in this district. I'm sorry, I'm going to make sure that the voters know that. And that is what we're talking about here.
Bill, I have to respond to that.
Yes, you have a
Christina, clearly you understand that the ACA is still here. So even after the individual mandate was repealed, we still have the ACA, and I support that. You have to separate out the individual mandate. All that says is that you are compelled to buy a product at this price. And the reason why that mandate didn't work, and I would clearly support a mandate that does work, because everybody should have health insurance, but that mandate was broken. Even the constructors of the ACA, many of them acknowledge that that mandate was broken. 10 years later, 30 million people don't have insurance, and you're not going to acknowledge that that's a broken individual mandate? Of course it is. So we can fix that and still maintain the Affordable Care Act, which we have today, and which I voted in accordance with every single time. And Christina, all of the organizations that endorse based on that issue have endorsed me. That should really tell everybody all they need to know.
Let's take another minute on this each, okay? Because if my understanding would be that if the repeal of the ACA in front of the Supreme Court would be based, I think the argument on the part of appellants is that because the individual mandate has been stricken, that the whole act should be stricken. Let's start with Mrs. Finello.
That is correct. So that is the whole basis. That is President Trump and his administration's lawyer exact argument. Again, they said that any congressperson who took that vote voted with the intent to dismantle the ACA. Dismantle, not fix it, dismantle it. So, that is where we are at. And like I said, I'm not in this for, touting how many endorsements I can have, and trying to get political cover because of a very detrimental vote that I've taken. I'm here because I want to represent the people, and the people are telling me how desperately upset they are and scared that once this goes through the Supreme Court, and what's happening right now with the Supreme Court and the Trump administration trying to ram through a justice that has been critical of the ACA, they are very afraid that they will not have health care, and they have a pre-existing condition, and they don't have the money to pay for that health care.
Yeah.
Congressman?
Christina, if what you were saying was true, you would have endorsements of groups that care about this issue supporting you. You do not. They are all backing me. Now, again, I'm going to be polite in how I characterize this. What you're saying is not true. You have to separate the individual mandate from the ACA, which the ACA exists now. I support the ACA now. I voted for the tax bill. If you want to make your whole campaign about the tax bill, let's have that debate. Focus on that. But don't try to say that I don't support the ACA when I unequivocally do. I unequivocally support it. And if my intent was to repeal it, then why, when this issue has come up in many forms and fashions in the past 4 years that I've been in Congress, in rule votes, in health care votes, in tax votes, and I voted with the Democrats on this issue every single time, 100%.
Moving on. I want to talk about the economic impact of COVID. 6 months ago, Congress passed the CARES Act, which is too long. It's too long of the acronym is too long for the real name to repeat, or the PPP, with aid for families and businesses. A second round of funding, the HEROES Act, is pending. What is your assessment of the CARES Act, as well as the content and status of the current HEROES legislation, or the pending HEROES legislation? Congressman Fitzpatrick first.
Yeah, I voted enthusiastically for the CARES Act because it was bipartisan. It was not perfect, but we needed to get liquidity into the economy, cash into the economy. It was put together quickly. It was disseminated quickly to get people the relief they need. I wish that House leadership would have taken the same perspective towards round 2 as they have towards round 1, and they have not, unfortunately, because many of them, regrettably, are putting politics, election year politics, over getting relief to the people they need. The HEROES Act, again, a lot of good things in it, with a lot of poison pills in it, including releasing people from prison due to COVID, including giving economic stimulus checks to people who are here illegally, thereby taking money out of the pockets of Americans. This most recent HEROES Act 2.0 cut cops grants funding, a defund the police measure to the tune of $600 million. 18 Democrats, this is a Democrat caucus, by the way, that votes in lockstep on virtually everything. 18 Democrats just voted against HEROES Act. I think that speaks volumes.
Mrs. Finello?
This COVID has been really tough on the economy, but again, it did not have to be this bad. People are scared. They've lost their jobs. I had a woman on Zoom we brought to tears because of the uncertainty, because she doesn't have the relief that she needs, because politicians like my opponent are playing games, political games with, with bills and doing things that aren't getting the relief in the people's hands, the hardworking families of this district when they need it the most. And, he'll give you a litany of reasons why he didn't want to do it, but he was there. And he could have tried to make the bill better. He could have, dealt with the problematic things, but instead he's going to, lie and misrepresent, because he's trying to cover up the fact that, we're in the largest economic crisis of our lifetimes. Republicans like Trump and Fitzpatrick have made sure that health care and employment benefits are out of reach for many Americans who are struggling to survive. My opponent chose Donald Trump and his party over extending relief for families, small businesses, school districts that are desperately need this money right now while they're grappling with whether kids are going back to school or doing virtual learning, state and local governments that are facing shortfalls, and frontline workers, including our police, nurses, firefighters. We voted against extending unemployment benefits, providing food and housing assistance, something that's desperately needed, something that was long needed here even before the pandemic. And he exposed extending eviction and foreclosure moratoriums, not once but twice. You know, we're in our 4th straight month where there are about a third of Americans who cannot make their housing payment right now, whatever that is, whether it's the rent or their mortgage. People are in need. People needed help back in the spring. We just can't keep coming back and figuring out that, oh, wait, maybe I should do something. No, we needed to do something back when the people needed relief, and people still need relief.
Thank you. Congressman, rebuttal.
Well, it's pretty clear what Christina Finello's approach to representation would be. Vote with the Democrat Party 100% of the time. Simple. You don't have to question it. You don't have to think about anything. You don't have to look at any nuance. Christina, there was a lot you just said there to unpack. I don't even know if we have enough time today to refute all of that. But are you accusing the 18 Democrats that voted with me against HEROES Act that they're playing political games, many of whom are in tough districts, running in tough re-elections right now? That's basically what you're saying, right? You're not saying it. Okay, so you're only saying that for Republicans that voted against it, but not Democrats. That's the problem, folks, is partisan politics, blind ideology. That is exactly everything that I fight against every single day in D.C.
Rebuttal? 1 minute.
No, it's not about, it's about political, what I don't like is political games. But what I do see here is a district that is crying out, that is asking for relief. And that's how I would be I don't need the congressman to tell me how I would be a representative. Here's what it is with me to be a representative. I understand what folks are going through. I've been there myself. If something is a good idea that will help people get whatever it is that they need, right now it's relief that they need, I will talk to anybody, regardless of the letter after their name, to make sure that we get the relief that we need. And if something needs to be fixed or adjusted in a bill, I'm going to do that. Not turn my back and just throw my hands up in the air and say, oops, I can't do anything. And meanwhile, the people of this district do not get the relief that they need. That's what I'm all about.
Let's add 30 seconds each to this topic and ask what is each candidate's best estimate on a timeline to get something, whether it's the HEROES Act or whatever we're going to call it in its final form, to get something passed in both houses of Congress.
Yeah.
Congressman?
That's entirely up to the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. She could bring us back tomorrow and pass the bipartisan Problem Solvers Caucus framework, where we had 25 Democrats and 25 Republicans, which I'm the co-leader of, the vice chair of the centrist bloc in Congress, that would pass, overwhelmingly pass. There were 24 Democrats that signed a letter saying they didn't even want to leave D.C. and go back home until we had this bipartisan bill put on the floor. The Speaker chose, unfortunately, regrettably, to put another partisan messaging bill on the floor that's a wish list to our liberal donors, rather than giving us the aid we need. We want to go back tomorrow, but we are in the minority. We got to wait for the Speaker to tell us when to go back and when she's going to have a bipartisan bill on the floor.
Mr. Finello, 30 seconds.
I mean, this relief needs to be passed as soon as possible. And the people down in Washington, like my opponent, have got to figure out a way to get relief passed and not just throw up their hands and just point fingers and say, oh, that's it, it's one party's fault. These bills also have to go through the Senate as well, and there are tons of things that have sat on Mitch McConnell's desk too. So but that's not really what this is all about here, is it? It's not. What it's about here is getting people the relief that they need.
Thank you. We're going to move on to the environment. I remember attending an event in the anniversary of William Penn, and every living governor, with the exception of Dick Thornburgh, was there, and Governor Rendell said, we're dreaming if we think that we can move into a carbon-free environment even in the next 20 or 30 years, and he considered himself an environmentalist. I want to have a reasonable discussion, and we've had a very reasonable discussion, by the way. I want to commend both of you for your demeanor thus far. But let's take any inflammatory rhetoric out of this and just try to answer this, okay? There are measurable increases in hurricanes, flooding, droughts, forest fires, and the average temperature of the Earth, with widespread agreement within the scientific community that these phenomena are the result of climate change. How can we ensure that our vast energy needs will continue to be met while at the same time moving in a direction to curb our carbon imprint and protect the environment. Ms. Finello, we start with you. 2 minutes.
We need to take this climate crisis seriously. I mean, I just can't believe we're in 2020 and I'm about to say that everyone deserves clean air and clean drinking water. You know, we've been talking about addressing climate change since I've been a teenager, and I'm in my mid-40s. And I live in a place where the water has been bad for most of my life. I spent a lot of my time in Warminster Township, and we've had bad water for over 30 years. And we've only really started talking about it in the past 10 years, and we haven't done anything serious about it yet. You know, and what really bothers me is that the Trump administration has spent the better part of the last 4 years rolling back environmental protections that would protect our clean water, clean air, and our public lands. You know, we need to reinstate those protections that were rolled back. We have to rejoin the Paris Agreement, and we have to help rebuild an economy with green and invest in green jobs and alternative energies. The problem is, though, you know, we have Republicans like my opponent in Congress who voted with the Trump tax bill that had major repercussions for the environment. It expanded oil and gas drilling in the United States. It left tax cuts intact for oil and gas companies while leaving us middle-class folk behind. And the tax bill was a windfall for oil and gas industries. They got massive tax cuts. And the other thing is, we know one of the biggest barriers to change in the environment is the influence of the money of the oil and gas companies. You know, the For the People Act would have helped limit the corrupting influence of oil and gas companies and their money, which is preventing us from making real change on the climate. We have to ensure that the people's voice is heard and it's not drowned out by the influence of oil and gas companies. You know, voters are far better at holding their representatives accountable. And my opponents all fit to vote against this bill. You know, I don't take any corporate PACs money, so I'm not beholden to them. But my opponent has taken, you know, almost $200,000 from oil and gas industries.
Congressman, the environment.
All right. Well, Christina, number one, you do take corporate PAC money, so you should stop saying that. Number two, there is one leading environmental organization in the nation, the League of Conservation Voters. They've endorsed one Republican in the entire United States of America. And guess who that is? And it's because I'm good on the environment, Christina. And they know that. The Environmental Defense Fund, who's supporting me, knows that. Clean Water Action, because of my PFAS work, know that. Because I was the author and introducer of the first ever bipartisan carbon pricing, carbon tax bill that would limit carbon emissions, exceed the Paris Climate Accord standards, and fund infrastructure. We had 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans introduce this. This was a huge accomplishment. We were able to bring together the business community, the labor community, and the environmental community, and that's not easy. Let me tell you, it's not easy. They have very, very disparate interests sometimes. We brought them together in the spirit of bipartisanship, in the spirit of compromise, to have a pro-climate bill to limit carbon emissions and protect our climate. And for that reason, the environmentalists are supporting me this race, which is, by the way, they don't endorse many Republicans. In fact, they've only endorsed one. So again, Christina's putting out a lot of rhetoric, which is very unfortunate, Christina. I wish the endorsements speak for themselves. They really do. So if you want to take your case to Environmental Defense Fund, League of Conservation Voters, apparently you don't think they're credible anymore, she's asking you to believe her and not all these groups and not my voting record.
Mrs. Finello, 1 minute.
I would take it to them, except they don't, they just give you the endorsements because that is what you're all about, all the endorsements that you have. Again, I go by actions. So for me, you cannot be about the environment if you're going to continue to take major money from oil and gas companies, if you're going to vote for bills that, have major repercussions for the environment. Again, the voters themselves are far better at holding our representatives accountable. And from what I hear from folks in the district is that not enough is being done on the environment, that they feel that it's been far too long. It's only about talk, and there's not been real action in the way of something that directly impacts them and their day-to-day lives. Like I said, I have grown up with the water that has been so poor for all these years. We are now paying in Warminster Township, Ivyland Borough, and Warwick Township far more for our water because of the fact that there is nothing appreciable been done to make sure that we have clean water.
Thank you. Congressman, 1 minute.
Yeah, the environmentalist movement in the United States of America disagrees with what she said about me and my record. They disagree with her, Christina. These are people that dedicate their lives. This is their full-time job, is to work these issues day in and day out with members of Congress who they know care about the issue, who are leaders on the issue, and they have chosen to endorse me. They don't endorse any Republicans. The League of Conservation Voters endorsed one Republican in the entire nation, and that was us. And there's a reason for that, Christina. And I think it's disrespectful to kind of brush off these endorsements. These are people that dedicate their lives to these causes, and they've all rallied around us in our campaign.
Thank you. We're going to move on to a discussion of Congress and the Supreme Court. Recently, Amy Coney Barrett has been nominated to the Supreme Court, and her confirmation seems likely. It is anticipated that a 6-3 ideological divide on the court could have a dramatic impact on the future of Roe v. Wade, the Affordable Care Act, and immigration. What role should Congress play in addressing these rights legislatively if they are altered by the court? And we start with Congressman Fitzpatrick.
Yeah, so as far as the nomination itself goes, you know, I have the same position, and by the way, when I first ran in 2016 was when Merrick Garland was nominated. And I remember I was at a panel in Indian Valley Chamber of Commerce back when that was part of our district, and I was asked, how should the Senate proceed? And I said they should absolutely give him a hearing. I believe that. Members of Congress serve for 2 years, not 1. Members of the Senate serve for 6 years, not 5, and presidents serve for 4 years, not 3. You can't stop working in election years. That's very important. Now, with that caveat that you should never artificially rush for political purposes, nor artificially delay for political purposes any nomination. It should take its normal course. And I think that's the fairest rule that we can have. So I think the same standard and the same position that I took with Merrick Garland ought to be afforded to Judge Barrett as well. With regard to legislating the issue, me and Bob Casey essentially had the identical legislative record on this issue. There was one vote that came up after 20 weeks allowing states to provide parameters to avoid the situation like Kermit Gosnell. J.D. Mullane's here. He covered that extensively. That is a horrific, horrific situation. And states and the federal government ought to be allowed to set parameters in place to avoid atrocities like occurred in the city of Philadelphia.
Mrs. Finello?
Before I get to that statement, let me just say I'm very concerned about the speed at which this nomination is being pushed through because of what is on the line, the Affordable Care Act and women's rights. And as I mentioned earlier with my situation of being put in the position of having to make a decision about my daughter and who I wanted to bring into that, these horrific stories about things that, you know, Kermit Gosnell did, they're just, that is not what women like myself, that is not the regular experience of women. You know, we're dealing, you know, women who have to make such decisions are dealing with a lot of trauma. They're dealing with very difficult decisions to be making. And the last thing they need is to have the government interfere by putting an extra test or any kind of parameters on things. That's not what women need. Women need to be able to make this decision of their own autonomy and and with themselves and choosing to bring whomever in. I would never want to be, and I was in that situation. I know many other women like me have shared this with me when I've told my story and they've told me theirs. It's about having that autonomy to make that decision and not having the government interfere in it, and by people that think, you know, the people who haven't been in that situation. It's just not right. And, you know, the balance and these issues that are going in front of the Supreme Court are so critical to the health care of our individuals, both in women's health care, but also those with pre-existing conditions. These are critical issues. These are life and death situations that people are grappling with every single day. And we shouldn't be so quick to push something through for political gain when we're talking about people's lives.
We're going to stay with this. I think Judge Barrett, soon to be Justice Barrett, has indicated that there are legislative remedies to things. The courts should take a hands-off policy whenever possible and have legislative remedies to whether it would be abortion, whether it would be fixing the Affordable Care Act, if that's indeed how they rule, and immigration, which I believe we have kind of dropped the ball on. I asked the same question about immigration in every congressional debate, I think, since 2010. So we have a minute left each. Respond any way you like, but you might want to address what I just brought up. Congressman?
Yeah, and I share your frustration with the immigration bill. In fact, probably more so than anything, that has not yet gotten done. And that could be a whole nother, hopefully that's a question in and of itself. When it comes to the judicial branch, I think it's very, very important that justices' personal opinions do not bear into their decision-making. And that's why I believe that the only way our three-branch system of government works is if the judicial branch takes the position that they are to interpret the law. So when they're interpreting statutes, they try to get a congressional intent. When they're interpreting questions of constitutional law, they're trying to get at our founders' intent. That's their job. They can't bring, if we have a politicized judicial branch, that's when the system collapses. And that's why it's so important that we have judges on the court that will interpret the law. Their personal opinions or personal faiths should not bear on any decisions.
Mrs. Finello?
But I don't know, but I'm afraid in this case, I mean, we already have Judge Comey, perhaps Justice Comey, soon to be Justice Comey, on record talking about the fact that she criticized the Affordable Care Act decision when it was upheld in 2015. So we pretty much know where she's going to go before the case is even heard. Similarly, with her views on abortion, she has made them known, and yeah, these should be free, but I don't see any consolation here on behalf of the people of this district and all Americans that those two will be separated, the personal from the legal decision in this particular case. And again, I think the speed at which that this nomination has been pushed through is because of that, because the Trump administration wants these votes and these decisions to go a certain way. And that's just not right.
Thank you. I'm going to stay with the Supreme Court just one more time and talk about the separation of powers in our government. I think what we've seen in the last couple of years are numerous instances when Congress has, as we know, a congressional oversight responsibility of the executive branch. Congress has attempted to exercise that responsibility through subpoena power, through calling witnesses and whatnot. And on numerous occasions, the executive branch has pushed back and declined to honor those requests. When you have that kind of struggle, it ultimately is resolved by the courts. I'd like to hear each of you comment for a minute about that struggle between the executive and legislative branch, specifically as it pertains to congressional oversight of the executive branch. Congressman?
Yeah, I'm a career FBI agent. Our investigations dependent on people honoring subpoenas. That's a court order. Congressional subpoenas are an order, not from the judicial branch, which subpoenas are, but from the legislative branch, and they ought to be honored. And I will never defend anybody who intentionally ignores or defies the subpoena. Again, to my earlier point about the sensitive balance of powers we have in all three branches of government, the system only works and our republic only survives if each institution in each branch respects the other. And the intentional defying of a subpoena without proper court excuse or exemption is unacceptable, and I will never defend that. I don't care who does that.
Thank you. Mrs. Finello?
I think it's incredibly important that there is a separation of powers. I mean, it's the very foundation upon which our country was founded. An independent judiciary is incredibly important. But also, what's equally important is that Congress does use their oversight jurisdiction, which is given to them, which in many cases we've seen time and time again, Republicans like my opponent and others not, cede that authority to the executive branch. And the executive branch has gotten far too much power these days, and Trump has just been, going around and trying to overtake a lot of the government with so many things that he's tried to do and using his executive power. And Congress has to step up, and equally the judiciary has to step up to make sure that we achieve that balance, because it is so critical to our democracy.
One more time with that. If we go back to the Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, where Justice John Marshall made a ruling in favor of the Cherokee, And it was a ruling that Andrew Jackson disagreed with, and Jackson famously said, Justice Marshall made his decision, let's see him enforce it. Would you comment on the potential for a constitutional crisis where you have a struggle between the legislative and executive branch, and the Supreme Court rules a particular way, the executive chooses not to honor it? Mrs. Finello first.
I mean, I think that's a very real thing. I mean, that's what the whole problem is with this, with the way that this, the Supreme Court nomination has played out. I mean, it's been incredibly concerning because we are really going to have a crisis of our democracy where, you know, we have major laws, things that are fundamental to the very basic rights of people of this country, and are under attack right now. And, you know, with President Trump and, you know, putting in executive orders in place that does no good for the people of this country. So I do see it. I mean, I see the very crisis that you're talking about is happening right now. And we have to have strong representatives in Congress that are willing to stand up to the executive branch, that are willing to stand up to the president, whoever that is. But especially, we have to have representatives that stand up to President Trump, because if we had representatives, we might be in a much better place right now.
Congressman?
Yeah, the issue of overreach typically and historically has been with the executive branch overreaching with the abuse or overreach of executive orders, and the judicial branch when there are instances of activist judges. Those are the two risks. And as I said earlier, you know, in law school, the constitutional law, the seminal case that every law student learns is Marbury versus Madison. It was the first time where our balance of powers was tested. The question was who decides. And the finding was the executive branch has a final say on administrative regulations, the legislative branch has a final say on legislation, and the judicial branch has a final say on issues of constitutional interpretation. So the only way our republic survives and sustains is if those three branches, number one, remain co-equal, and number two, they respect each other's different roles in our government. Once there's an upset, whether it be an executive overreach with executive orders or judicial overreach with activist judges that are legislating from the bench, that's what we have to prevent.
Thank you. We're going to move on. As I said at the beginning of the debate, these questions are a synthesis of numerous questions and suggestions submitted by the public, and they were overwhelmingly tilted toward domestic affairs rather than foreign policy. So I was able to synthesize one collection of thoughts into a foreign policy question, and this is it. It's in reference to our posture in the world. Previously, the United States decided not to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We've also pulled out of the Paris Climate Accords. Our relations with NATO allies is strained at best, and we're experiencing the most trade restrictions since the 1920s. Do you agree with these policies? What should our posture be moving forward? We start with Mrs. Finello.
There's been a lot of things wrong with the Trump administration, but one of the things that I think has been so problematic has been our role in the United States as it relates to other foreign powers. You mentioned a number of things, but what I find most concerning is the fact that our country has now had a diminished role with a lot of our allies. And, and as the granddaughter of, two World War II veterans who very much always talked about fighting for our country, but fighting alongside our allies, and how important those relationships are in making sure that we are dealing with not only our own country's issues, but issues as around the world. And the fact that we don't have as strong of a place in the world as we used to because of the Trump administration, because he has not worked together with many countries, has, kind of does knee-jerk reactions and foreign policy by tweet. And it's really sad to me that that's where we've gotten to in the world. We do need to forge these strong alliances. I talked about rejoining the Paris Climate Accords because we do need to take action on the environment. And it's not just us. It's not just the United States. It's a collection of countries. And we do our best work when we're working together with our allies.
Thank you. Congressman?
Yeah, I think you had two questions. I think she only answered the Paris. You also answered about, you also asked about the TPP.
And NATO and
Yeah.
trade restrictions.
So I will tell you the transportation, I think one is good and one is bad. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, I think we should have withdrawn from that, and that's a good thing. And that had bipartisan support. A lot of our building trades, a lot of our labor unions were very, very uncomfortable with it because it was sort of a one-size-fits-all agreement that encompassed over 40% of the world GDP and trade, and that's too much. I'm personally an advocate of bilateral trade agreements that are specific to what a country has to offer our country and vice versa. With the Paris Climate Accord, not only do I think it was a terrible idea to withdraw, I voted and was a co-sponsor of a bill to re-enter and re-engage the United States in the Paris Climate Accord because I believe that climate change is a huge problem that we need to get our arms around. I believe the United States needs a seat at that table. That's an issue of global leadership. Again, one of the reasons why I've been had such good relationship with our environmental movement across America is because of my position on this issue. But TPP, I think it was a good decision to withdraw. Our labor unions were opposed to it. There was too much trying to pack into one trade agreement, I believed.
Thank you. Again, we have 1 minute each. You can use it any way you like, but I would like to, we haven't addressed our relationship with our NATO allies. Mrs. Finello?
You know, I think, you know, anytime we look at trade agreements, and of course, you know, growing up in a union family, it's always really important that we support our workers and make sure those type of agreements are fair. And yes, there's been a lot of concern from the unions about the TPP and others. You know, I also think, again, it's incredibly important to make sure that our traditional allies, particularly in some of those in NATO, it is important to maintain relationships with our longstanding allies. And the fact that we haven't done so, in fact, the fact that the Trump administration thinks we know better than many of our allies and doesn't form that cooperative relationship with them is extremely troubling and concerning to me.
Thank you. Congressman?
I'm good.
That's it? So we don't really want to talk about NATO?
Sure.
Let's do another 30 seconds. NATO.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, listen, I served the overwhelming amount of time that I spent overseas was in NATO countries, and it's incredibly important. Our relationships, and this goes to a comment you made earlier about how the foreign leaders and foreign countries view the United States of America. When I was overseas during the Obama administration, they were criticizing that administration mainly during my time in Ukraine, when Russia annexed the entire southern tip of Ukraine, Crimea, with impunity, when there was this ongoing invasion to the east in Donbass, with impunity, when there was a red line drawn in the sand with Syria that was crossed without repercussion. That caused a lot of people to not have faith in that administration. We have similar examples now where our relationship is deteriorating under this current administration. We have to consider our long-term relationship with our allies, for sure.
Jessica, you can allow Mrs. Finello more time, because I want to allow the Congressman to finish that thought. Mrs. Finello?
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, like I said, I mean, I think that's the crux of this. I mean, you know, right now we're in the Trump administration, and, you know, he has done far more to hurt our relationships with all of our foreign powers. I mean, we even have a situation where there are governments like Russia that think that they can interfere in our elections with no repercussions. We need to be able to have an administration and representatives that stand up when we know that our very democracy is being attacked. And there's been silence on that, not only by my opponent, but there has been voting against looking into Russian interference in our elections. And, you know, we have to make sure that when countries invade upon in our country in any different way, multiple kinds of ways, we have to make sure that we stand up and protect our interest.
Thank you. We're going to move on to our last question. And invariably, at the end of these debates, I'm asked, why didn't you ask a question about this topic or that topic? And the answer is because there isn't enough time. So to get myself off the hook, we're going to pass the buck to the two candidates, and we're going to do it like this. It's impossible to address all the topics, so at this point, I'm going to invite each of you to address one question to your opponent on a topic of your choice. It will be Congressman Fitzpatrick's turn to ask first. but I'm going to give both of you a chance to organize your thoughts while I review some important election information for the public, and then we'll come back and you guys will ask your questions, okay? With regard to election information in the voting process, the last day to register before the November election is October 19th. You may vote in person at your local precinct or by mail. The last day to apply for a ballot, for a mail-in ballot, is October 27th. The last day for county boards of elections to receive voted mail-in ballots is November 3rd. Therefore, it's imperative that you do things quickly if you choose to vote by mail. In addition to mailing in your ballots, you may deposit them at 3 drop boxes in county properties in Bucks County. There's going to be one in Levittown, one in Doylestown, and one in Quakertown. In addition, there's a concept, now it's really just another form of mail-in balloting, but it's called on-demand voting. You can go to one of those 3 locations and you can demand your ballot at that point. Rather than mailing in a request for a ballot, they can hand you a ballot at that time. You can fill out a ballot right there. You still have to insert it in the small envelope, which goes in the big envelope. You still have to fill out the information required on the big envelope, but then you can drop it right in the box. So you can cut, if you're willing to take that trip, you can cut that time concern for yourself. Again, you must insert, if you're voting by mail, you must insert your ballot in the small privacy envelope provided. There may be no markings on that privacy envelope. You then insert it in the outside envelope and complete the declaration section on that envelope and sign it. For more information, for the best information, go to the Bucks County website and select the red, white, and blue election link that will answer all of your questions and review what I just said. Finally, I want to remind the media present that any interviews with the candidates will take place for safety reasons outside of the building, and it's, of course, up to the availability of the candidates. So with that, it's time for our final questions, and we're going to go, and then, of course, we're still going to have a closing statement from each candidate. So, Congressman Fitzpatrick, you get to ask the question first, and Mrs. Finello gets 2 minutes to answer.
I'm asking a question of Christine.
You're answering the question to her, and she gets 2 minutes to answer.
Sure. Christina, you are obviously well aware of my independence ranking, #1 in the nation, by the metric that every member of Congress follows and respects, Georgetown University. It's the #1 in the nation across all 435 congressional districts. It's the highest score ever recorded by the Lugar Center in Georgetown University, breaking an historical record. You're aware that I have broad-ranging endorsements, labor unions, environmentalists, animal rights, Chamber of Commerce, you name it, across the board. You're also aware of the votes that I've cast, tough votes where I've crossed my party, including voting to condemn tweets on the floor of the House of Representatives, a very bold move, raising the minimum wage, re-entering the Paris Climate Accord, supporting organized labor, expanding voting rights, equal pay for equal work, not the renaming of a post office. Major, major issues. So my question for you is, and you have a lot of options, there's 435 members of the House, I'm one, so there's 434 other members. Can you name me one of my colleagues, Democrat or Republican, who has a more independent voting record than I do?
No, because that, you just said that you were ranked the #1 most independent congressman, but that is merely a ranking. I take issue with the fact that your record really belies that fact. When it matters most and when it matters for the people of this district, you are not the independent congressman that you claim that you are. You cannot be an independent congressman when you vote for a Trump tax bill that benefits the most wealthy in corporations, that votes to gut the ACA, that votes against oversight to ensure pandemic relief, that instead of going to struggling small businesses, it goes to large corporations. When you vote against extending emergency unemployment for hardworking families when they desperately need it the most, and when you vote to not extend foreclosures and evictions, not once but twice, in the middle of a once-in-a-generation pandemic. So, again, by the metric that's set out, I cannot answer that question, but again, I take issue with the fact that your record simply doesn't bear out the fact that you are the most independent congressman.
Mrs. Finello, you'll ask your question. And Congressman Fitzpatrick will have 2 minutes to respond.
So my question is for you. You talk about all the work that you do with and for your constituents. Why is it that you do not avail yourselves of your constituents with a real town hall. And by real town hall, I mean something where it, pre-pandemic, because there was a long time before the pandemic, you can be with the people, open, anybody can come, not get a golden ticket, and make sure that they have their concerns heard and are able to ask questions in an unfiltered way. For a representative, I would think your best asset as a representative, and it certainly will be when I'm the representative, would be your constituents' views and the input from your constituents. So why have you not made yourself available to them?
Congressman?
Yeah, I think we can answer that by saying you and I have very different definitions of what a town hall is. I think what you're defining as a town hall is a cattle call in a gymnasium where people just show up and scream at each other, and it's mass chaos, and nobody's able to answer any questions. If your question is accessibility, Christina, do you have any question that I'm not an accessible member of Congress in my district? Because I can tell you the voters disagree with you, and you'll see when they disagree with you on Election Day. They know that I'm incredibly accessible. A good chunk, I joke that half of this district has my personal cell number, which I'm on all the time talking to them. Open Q&As, unfiltered Q&As that I perform at every single high school in this district, chambers of commerce, environmental groups, you name it. We have them all the time. What we don't have is shouting matches where people are holding up cards run by Indivisible with mass amounts of protests out front. That's what we don't do because that doesn't benefit anybody. And it's disrespectful to people that actually show up that want their question answered to get an answer. So the issue is accessibility. I perform countless forums across this district, and the voters know that, and you'll see that on Election Day.
Guess we will.
Thank you. Thank you, both candidates. We now have 1 minute each for closing statements, and we start with Mrs. Finello.
Thank you very much. So here's my question to the voters. Who do you want looking out for you? A person like my Republican opponent who turns our back on us? Trump has mismanaged this pandemic and pushed us further into an economic crisis, and my Republican opponent has enabled him. And as we just talked about, despite his claims, a closer look at his record shows you that he is not the independent congressman he pretends to be. When it matters most, Brian Fitzpatrick sides with Donald Trump and corporate and special interests instead of the hardworking families of the people of this district. He's chosen partisan politics over protecting working people throughout this pandemic. Who do you want looking out for you? Too often people in Washington, like my opponent, go down and make the lives of their constituents harder. That's not what I'm all about. I'm going to go down and make the lives of you much, much easier. Your representative should work in your best interests and be available. This is our community. I have lived and worked in this community and made this community a better place for the people that I serve. I'm a mother, a daughter, a wife, a council person, and a member of this community. I'm Christina Finello. Thank you for letting me earn your vote.
Thank you. Congressman?
Yeah, thank you, Bill, once again for moderating and doing a fabulous job as you always do. Christina, thank you for participating in the forum and the debate. And elections are about choices, and boy, do we have a choice here. A very, very stark choice. My opponent has referred to Nancy Pelosi as her mentor. She said she proudly accepts the endorsement of Elizabeth Warren. She said in the primary debate on this very stage that she had no issue with the term socialism being used within her party. And I just asked her a very simple question, and I think that answers it all. Give me one colleague in the entire body of the United States Congress that's more independent than me, and she said she can't. So I think that really speaks for itself. She's asking you to dismiss my votes, dismiss all the endorsements, do all that. Just listen to her. That's what she wants you to do. Christina, the body of evidence is enormous and overwhelming and speaks volumes. And I will just end with this. You all hear me talk an awful lot about the Bipartisan Problem Solvers Caucus. It's what I believe to my core. I believe that the biggest threat we face as a nation, and we face a lot, is hyperpartisanship, the way we talk to each other, this rigid ideological demands from the left and the right. Our country is broken when we go down that path. We have to come together. That's what I am all about, and the voters know that. Thank you.
I want to commend the candidates for a spirited, informative, and very courteous debate. It serves democracy well. I want to congratulate the candidates for offering yourselves to the voters, putting your name on a ballot, subjecting yourselves to criticism and time away from families and friends, and that's deeply appreciated. And of course, I want to thank Bucks County Community College for its ongoing commitment to informing the students and the residents of Bucks County on issues of the day. I urge everyone to show your patriotism this November by doing two things: by voting and by wearing a mask and observing social distancing. Thank you very much for your time, and thank you, Mrs. Finello and Congressman Fitzpatrick.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bill.
And we're finished.
All right. Well, I think that wraps it up. The candidates are walking off the, I guess, stage, as you could call it, right now. They're walking past the podiums, and they're prepared to exit the building, likely. So first, pretty long debate, but pretty standard as well.
Yeah.
It's typical to have extensive discussions on these issues. First, I'd like to just get your thoughts on presentation. How do you think the candidates fared in how they presented themselves to the voters? Did they feel comfortable on this stage, and how do you think it went from an aspect like that?
Well, I think it was interesting. I mean, they didn't have the audience to play off of, so that made it a little more interesting, probably for Congressman Fitzpatrick more than Christina Finello, because he's done this so many times before. So that was interesting. The format was interesting, given the fact that there wasn't an audience. So when they walked out, they just kind of walked out by themselves, and their respective campaign managers followed. That made things much different. Brian Fitzpatrick's done this enough times where he's kind of polished his debate performance. Christina Finello, from a lot of people I talked to after her primary election debate, said she seemed a little rough in her presentation. This time, much more smooth and polished. I know just from the debate, I was talking on Twitter, messages and texts with a Republican and Democrat. The Republican thought, obviously, Brian Fitzpatrick won. He also thought Christina Finello relied on too many talking points. The Democrat had thought Brian Fitzpatrick relied too much on talking about his endorsements and kind of lacked the touch that Christina brought, mentioning all the people she's talked to and hearing their issues.
Yeah. I would mostly agree with that. I think it's just an inexperience issue where maybe the next debate that they have, Finello, she seemed a little uncomfortable at times, but obviously I think that's a matter of experience, like you said, where Fitzpatrick just has been doing this for a little longer. The next, I think the big thing that people were looking for in this was, will Finello be able to tie Fitzpatrick to Trump? And I think that's, on all of the issues, that was what they came back to. Did Fitzpatrick vote in lockstep with Trump on this issue?
Right.
And, is he independent or not? And just from a political standpoint, where they were able to ask each other a question at the end, and I'm sure you heard this, where Finello was asked, is there someone more independent than I am? And she said no. And
Right.
that, I think, from just a political operation standpoint, I was shocked to hear that. Do you think that'll hurt her come November, given that she was trying to tie him to Trump the whole time, and then at the end she said no?
I have to imagine at this point, with everything being so divided, that it might not help a ton. And also how many regular people are going to watch the debate to the conclusion. Hopefully everyone, but
Hopefully.
that's not always the case. But I thought it was interesting, her response. She seemed very caught off guard by Brian Fitzpatrick's question. On the other hand, Brian Fitzpatrick was a special agent in the FBI and a lawyer. So he has that advantage. I'm sure he's talked to people before when he was overseas. He worked with interrogators. So I'm sure he came to that with a lot more skill than maybe Christina Finello did, who also is an attorney, but most of her experience has been an executive with human services in the county and in providing those important services.
One thing that I did want to bring up that we had just discovered while the debate was going on, a press release was sent out from the Finello campaign, and it divulged some information on what we were talking about before, and I'll let you take that away.
Yeah, so this is some really big news for the Finello campaign. They sent out a press release. This morning, Brian Fitzpatrick's campaign announced they had what they term a record-setting for the district fundraising haul in the third quarter of just over $900,000. Finello, who's had trouble gaining traction with fundraising, she announced a record-breaking $925,000 haul in the third quarter. Still looking to get some more information from her campaign, but that is obviously going to give her a big boost financially coming out of this debate and coming in the final weeks of the election. I don't know, we'll have to see how it all turns out in the end, but that is a big fundraising haul.
Yeah, I was very surprised to see those numbers, especially considering that she did struggle in the second quarter. I mean, she did raise a considerable amount. I think it was $200,000 about, but to see such an increase and to pretty much, I mean, I know it was slightly more than the congressman, but in terms of actual, ability to spend those dollars, pretty much an equal amount.
Yeah, so he has the cash on hand advantage, as you had mentioned earlier.
He certainly does. Yeah, it was just the fact that they raised pretty much the same amount came to me as a surprise. One thing that our tech guy, Chris Ermer, points out, and thank you, Chris, for the fantastic, and Brianne, for the fantastic jobs that both of you are doing. He points out that Finello didn't bring up the impeachment at all. Yeah. And I was very surprised that there wasn't really a question about it. I mean, we're talking about trying to remove a president from office, and it seems like both of them could have said something about it. They didn't really talk about it. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think both these candidates, going back to what we were talking about before, have a really tough line to toe. They both can't be too partisan one way or the other. And they need to prove Finello needs to win over some Trump voters. Brian Fitzpatrick needs to win over some Joe Biden voters. And I think they didn't want to say anything that really would make that difficult and make it harder than it has to be for them. They both tried to toe the moderate line.
Yeah.
One can disagree or agree with how moderate Brian Fitzpatrick is or Christina Finello is, but you saw Congressman Fitzpatrick up there try to mention defunding the police. It's a big Republican talking point, and Christina Finello brought up the Affordable Care Act, a big Democratic talking point that they've said they're trying to use that running up to the election. Both sides for their advantage, those issues. They're kind of wedge issues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it was definitely an interesting thing to watch where both people, there tends to be an expression, the race to the middle, race to the center when it comes to politics, where in the primary someone will be a little more out there, and then as you get closer to the general election, they'll try to be more middle on the line on issues. I don't think it's been such a race to the middle in a long time. I mean, there was essentially on several issues, it seemed like they mostly agreed on things, but said it in ways that it made them seem starkly different.
Sure.
And, you want to talk about the ACA, where both of them are saying that they support the ACA, but that the other person doesn't understand it or doesn't support it, and it's going to be very interesting what actually got through to voters, I think, is what it comes down to, because any candidate can say one thing or another, but it's what the voters believe is really what it comes down to. So I think that might do it for us. I don't know if we can wrap things up here. I know Joe LeCompte has some tunes that he might be able to fill us in with, but I know that Yardley on Air is coming up, and that's with the mayor of Yardley, Chris Harding, and he does that every Tuesday, well, not every Tuesday, but every other Tuesday from 2 to 3 p.m. So thank you so much, Tom Sofield, for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
It's a wonderful thing to see local media outlets able to collaborate and not always pit up against each other like it seems sometimes they do, and to come together as friends and collaborators for a political debate, I think is a wonderful thing to see. So, Tom, thank you so much. Levittown
thanks for
Now.
having me.
Keep doing great work in the community. I'm Rick Rickman. I'm the news director at WBCB. It's been a pleasure to host this debate with Tom, and of course, Chris Ermer and Brianne. Thank you so much for the work that you do, and Bill Pezza, of course, our moderator, for making sure that everything went smoothly. And from the Lower Epstein campus, I'm Rick Rickman.